Chapter 6 of Masters of the Vortex by E. Smith. Chapter 6 Driving Jets or Weapons. Cloud's swearing wasted no time. He could swear and act simultaneously. He flashed his vessel up near the lifeboat, went inert, and began to match its intrinsic velocity. He'd have to board, no other way. Even if he had anything to blast it with, and he didn't, his vessel wasn't armed. He couldn't without killing innocent people. What did he have? He had 2 suits of armor, a GP regulation, and his Vortex special, which was even stronger. He had his delameters. He had 4 semi-portables and 2 needle beams for excavating. He had thousands of duodec bombs, not one of which could be detonated by anything less violent than the furious heart of a loose atomic vortex. What else? Well, there was his sampler. He grinned as he looked at it. About the size of a carpenter's hand axe, with a savage beak on one side and a wickedly curved razor-sharp blade on the other. It had a double grip handle 3 feet long. A deceptive little thing, truly, for it was solid durium. It weighed 15 pounds, and its ultra-hard, ultra-tough blade could shear through Neal carb alloy as cleanly as a steel knife slices cheese. Considering what terrific damage a Valerian could do with a space axe, he should be able to do quite a bit with this. It ought to qualify at least as a space hatchet. He put on his armor, set his delameters to maximum intensity at minimum aperture, and hung the sampler on a belt hook. He eased off his blasts. There, the velocities matched. A minute's work with needle beam, tractors, and pressors sufficed to cut the 2 smaller ships apart and to dispose of the Nealian's magnets and cables. Another minute of careful manipulation and his scout was in place. He swung out, locked the port behind him, and entered the lifeboat. He was met by a high-intensity beam. He'd not expected instantaneous undeclared war, but he was ready for it. Every screen he had was full out. His left hand held poised at hip a screen delameter. His return blast was therefore a reflection of Darjeeb's bolt, and it did vastly more damage. The hand in which Darjeeb held the projector was the one that had been manhandling the pilot, and it was not quite back inside the Nealian's screens. In the fury of Cloud's riposte, then gun in hand disappeared, as did also a square foot of panel behind them. But Darjeeb had other hands and other guns, and for seconds blinding beams raved against unyielding screens. Neither screen went down. The Tellurian bolstered his weapons. It wouldn't take much of this stuff to kill the passengers remaining in the saloon. He'd go in with his sampler. He lugged it up and leaped straight at the flaming projector with all of his mass and strength going into the swing of his space hatchet. The monster did not dodge, but merely threw up a hand to flick the toy aside with his gun barrel. Cloud grinned fleetingly as he realized what the other must be thinking, that the man must be puny indeed to be making such ado about wheedling such a trifle, for to anyone not familiar with durium it is surely unbelievable that so much mass and momentum can possibly reside in a bulk so small. Thus, when fiercely driven cutting edge met opposing ray gun, it did not waver or deflect. It scarcely even slowed. Through the metal of the gun that vicious blade sliced resistlessly, shearing flesh as it sped. On down, urged by everything Cloud's straining muscles could deliver. Through armor it slashed, through the bony plating covering that tremendous double shoulder, deep into the flesh and bone of the shoulder itself, being stopped only by the impact of the hatchet's haft against the armor. Then, planting one steel boot on the helmet's dome, he got a momentary stance with the other between barrel body and flailing arm, bent his back, and heaved. The deeply embedded blade tore out through bone and flesh and metal, and as it did so the 2 rear cabled arms dropped useless. That mighty rear shoulder and its appurtenances were out of action. The monster still had one good hand, however, and he was still full of fight. That hand flashed out to seize the weapon and to wield it against its owner. It came fast, too, but the man, strongly braced, yanked backwards. Needlepoint and keen edge tore through flesh and snicked off fingers. Cloud swung his axe aloft and poised, making it limpidly clear that the next blow would be straight down into the top of the head. That was enough. Darjeeb backed away, every eye glaring, and Cloud stepped warily over to Luda. A couple of strokes of his blade gave him a length of chain. then working carefully to keep his foe threatened at every instant. He worked the chain into a tight loop around the monster's front neck, pulled it unmercifully taut around a stanchion, and welded it there with his delameter. He did not trust the other monster unreservedly either, bound as she was. In fact, he did not trust her at all. In spite of family rows, like sticks to lake in emergencies, and they'd gang up on him if they could. Since she wasn't wearing armor, however, she didn't stand a chance with a delameter, so he could take time now to look around. The pilot, lying flat upon the floor, was beginning to come to. Not quite flat either, for a shapely Chickeladorian girl, wearing the 41 square inches of covering, which were de rigueur in her eyes, had his bandaged head in her lap, or rather cushioned on one bare leg, and was sobbing gibberish over him. That wouldn't help. Cloud started for the first aid locker, but stopped. A white-wrapped figure was already bending over the injured man with a black bottle in her hand. He knew what it was. Catacillin. That was what he was after himself, but he wouldn't have dared give a hippopotamus the terrific jolt she was pouring into him. She must be a nurse or maybe a doctor, but Cloud shivered in sympathy nevertheless. The pilot stiffened convulsively, then relaxed. His eyes rolled. He gasped and shuddered, but he came to life and sat up groggily. "What the hell goes on here?" Cloud demanded urgently in Space Eel. "I don't know," the pigman replied. "All the ape said, as near as I could get it, was that I had to give him our free drive." Then he spoke rapidly of the girl, his wife, Cloud guessed. If she wasn't, she ought to be, who was still holding him fervently. The pink girl nodded. Then, catching Cloud's eye, she pointed at the two monstrosities, then at the nurse standing calmly nearby. Startlingly slim, swathed to the eyes in billows of glamourette, she looked as fragile as a wisp of straw. But Cloud knew Minorcans. She, too, nodded at the Tellurian, then talked rapidly with her hands to a short, thick-set, tremendously muscled woman of some race entirely strange to the blaster. She was used to going naked, that was very evident. She had been wearing a light robe of convention, but had been pretty well demolished in the melee, and she did not realize that what was left of it was hanging in tatters down her broad back. The squatty eyed the gesticulating Minorcan and spoke, in a beautifully modulated deep bass voice, to a supple, lithe, pantherish girl, with vertically slitted yellow eyes, pointed ears, and a long and sinuous, meticulously groomed tail. The Vagian, by no means first of a race Cloud had seen, spoke to the Chickeladorian eyeful, who in turn passed the message along to her husband. "The bonehead you had the argument with says to hell with you," the pilot translated to Cloud and Space Eel. "He says his mob will be out here after him directly, and if you don't cut him loose and give him the dope he wants, they'll burn us all to cinders." Luda was, meanwhile, trying to attract attention. She was bouncing up and down, rattling her chains, rolling her eyes, and in general demanding notice. More communications ensued, culminating in, "The one with fancy work skull, she's a frail, but not the other bonehead's frail, I guess. Says pay no attention to the ape. He's a murderer, a pirate, a bum, a louse, and so forth, she says. Says to take your axe, it's some cleaver, she says, and I check her to 10 decimals on that. Cut his goddamn head off, chuck his stinking carcass over the port, and get the hell out of here as fast as you can blast." That sounded to Cloud like good advice, but he didn't want to take such drastic action without more comprehensive data. "Why?" he asked. But this was too much for the communications relays to handle. Cloud did not know Space Eel all too well, since he'd not been out in deep space very long. Also, Space Eel is a very simple language, not well adapted to the accurate expression of subtle nuances of thought, and all those intermediate translations were garbling things up terrifically. Hence Cloud was not surprised that nothing much was coming through, even though the prettied-up monster was, by this time, just about throwing a fit. "She's quit trying to spin her yarn," the pilot said finally. "She says she's been trying to talk to you direct, but she can't get through. Says to unseal your ports, cut your screens, let down your guard, something like that. Anyway, don't know what she does mean exactly. None of us does except maybe the Minorcan, and if she does, she can't get it across on her fingers. Perhaps my thought screen." Cloud cut it. "More yet," the Chickeladorian went on shortly. She says there's another one, just as bad or worse. On your head, she says. No, on your head bone. What the hell? Skull! No, inside your skull, she says now. Hell's bells. I don't know what she is trying to say. Maybe I do. Keep still a minute, all of you. A telepath, undoubtedly, like the Monarchans. That was why she had to talk to her first. He'd never been around telepaths much, never tried it. He walked a few steps and stared directly into one pair of Luda's eyes. Large, expressive eyes, now soft and gentle. That's it, Chief. Now blast away, baffle your jets, relax, I guess she means. Open your locks and let her in. Cloud did relax, but gingerly. He didn't like this mind-to-mind stuff at all, particularly when the other mind belonged to such a monster. He lowered his mental barriers skittishly, ready to revolt at any instant. But as soon as he began to understand the meaning of her thoughts, he forgot completely that he was not talking man to man. And at that moment, such was the power of Luda's mind and the precision of her telepathy, every nuance of thought became sharp and clear. I demand Darjeeb's life, Luda stormed. Not because he's the enemy of all my race, that would not weigh with you, but because he's done what no one else, however base, has ever been so lost to shame as to do. In our city upon Loon he kindled an atomic flame which is killing us in multitudes. In case you do not know, such flames can never be extinguished. I know, we call them loose atomic vortices, but they can be extinguished. In fact, putting them out is my business. Oh, incredible but glorious news! Luda's thoughts seethed, became incomprehensible for a space. Then, to win your help for my race, I perceive that I must be completely frank. Observe my mind closely, please. See for yourself that I withhold nothing. Darjeeb wants at any cost the secret of your vessel's speed. With it his race would destroy mine utterly. I want it too, of course. With it we could wipe out the Nilians. However, since you are much stronger than would be believed possible, since you defeated Darjeeb in single combat, I realize my helplessness. I tell you, therefore, that both Darjeeb and I have long since summoned help. Warships of both sides are approaching, to capture one or both of these vessels. The Nilians are the nearer, and these secrets must not, under any conditions, go to Neal. Dash out into space with both of these ships, so that we can plan at leisure. First, however, kill that unspeakable murderer. You have scarcely injured him the way it is. Or give me that so deceptive little axe, and I'll be only too glad to do it myself. A chain snapped ringingly, metal clanged against metal. Only two of Darjeeb's major arms had been incapacitated. His two others had lost only a few fingers apiece from their hands. His immense bodily strength was almost unimpaired. He could have broken free at any time, but he had waited, hoping to take Cloud by surprise or that some opportunity would arise for him to regain control of the lifeboat. But now, feeling sure that Luda's eminently sensible advice would be taken, he decided to let inertialessness go, for the moment, in the interest of saving his life. "Kill him!" Luda shrieked the thought, and Cloud swung his weapon aloft. But Darjeeb was not attacking. Instead, he was rushing into the airlock, escaping. "Go free, pilot!" Cloud commanded, and leaped, but the inner valve swung shut before he could reach it. As soon as he could operate the lock, Cloud went through it. He knew that Darjeeb could not have boarded the Scout since her ports were locked. He hurried to his control room and scanned space. There the Nilian was, falling like a plummet. There also were a dozen or so spaceships, too close for comfort, blasting upward. Cloud cut in his Bergenholm, kicking on his driving blasts, cut off and went back into the lifeboat. Safe enough now, he thought. They'll never get out here inert. I'm surprised he jumped. Didn't figure him as a suicidal type. He isn't. He didn't, Luda thought dryly. Huh? He must have. That was a mighty long flit he took off on, and his suit wouldn't hold air. He would stuff something into the holes. If necessary, he could have made it without air, or armor either. He's tough. He still lives, curse him. But it is of no use for me to bewail that fact now. Let us make plans. You must put out the flame, and the leaders of our people will convince you. Just a second, some other things come first. He fell silent. First of all, he had to report to the patrol, so they could get some Lensmen and a task force out here to straighten up this mess. With ordinary communicators, that would take some doing. But wait, he had a double-ended tight beam to the laboratory. He could get through on that, probably, even from here. He'd have to mark the lifeboat as a derelict and get these people aboard his cruiser. No space tube. The women could wear suits, but this Luda. Don't worry about me, that entity cut in. You saw how I came aboard. I don't enjoy breathing vacuum, but I'm as tough as Darjeeb is, so hurry! During every moment you delay, more of my people are dying. QX, while we're transferring, give me the dope. Luda did so. Darjeeb's coup had been carefully planned and brilliantly executed. Drugged by one of her own staff, she'd been taken without a struggle. She did not know how far-reaching the stroke had been, but she was pretty sure that most, if not all, of the Dillian fortresses were now held by the enemy. Neal probably had the advantage in numbers and in firepower then upon Loon. Darjeeb would not have made his bid unless he had found a way to violate the treaty of strict equality. Dill was, however, much the nearer the two worlds. Hence, if this initial advantage could be overcome, Dill's reinforcements could be brought up much sooner than the enemy's. If, in addition, the vortex could be extinguished before it had done irreparable damage, neither side would have any real advantage, and the conflict would subside instead of flaring into another tri-world holocaust. Cloud pondered. He would have to do something, but what? That vortex had to be snuffed, but with the whole Nilian army to cope with, how could he make the approach? His vortex bombing flitter was screened against radiation, not war beams. His cruiser was clothed to stop anything short of GP primaries, but it would take a month at a patrol base to adapt her for vortex work, and he'd have to analyze it anyway, preferably from the ground. He had no beams, no ordinary bombs, no negabombs. How could he use what he had to clear a station? "Draw me a map, will you, Luda?" he asked. She did so. The cratered vortex where an immense building had been. The ring of fortresses, two of which were unusually far apart, separated by a parkway and a shallow lagoon. "Shallow? How deep?" Cloud interrupted. She indicated a depth of a couple of feet. "That's enough map, then. Thanks." Cloud thought for minutes. "You seem to be quite an engineer. Can you give me exact details on your defensive screen? Power, radius, weave form, generator type, phasing, interlocking, blow-off, and so on?" She could. Complex mathematical equations and electrical formulae flashed through his mind, each leaving a residue of fact. "Maybe we can do something," the blaster said finally, turning to the Chickaladorian. "Depends pretty much on our friend here. Are you a pilot or just an emergency assignment?" "Master pilot, rating unlimited, tonnage or space." "Good. Think you're in shape to take 3,000 centimeters of acceleration?" "Pretty sure of it. If I was right, I could take 3,000 standing on my head. I'm feeling better all the time. Let's hot her up and find out." "Not until after we've unloaded these passengers somewhere." And Cloud went on to explain what he had in mind. "Afraid it can't be done." The pilot shook his head glumly. "Your timing has got to be too ungodly fine. I can do the piloting, meter the blast, and so on. I can balance her down on her tail, steady to her hair. But piloting's only half what you got to have. Pilots never land on a constant blast, and your leeway here is damn near zero. To hit it as close as you want, your timing's got to be accurate to a tenth of a second. You don't know it, mister, but it'd take a master computer half a day to... I know about all that. I'm a master computer, and I'll have everything figured. I'll give you a zero exact to plus or minus 100th. QX, then. Let's dump the non-combatants and flit." "Luda, where should we land them? And maybe you'd better call out your army and navy. We can't blow out that vortex until we control both air and ground." "Land them there." Luda swung the plate and pointed. "The call was sent long since. They come." They landed, but 4 of the women would not leave the vessel. The Monarchan had to stay aboard, she declared, or she'd be disgraced for life. What would happen if the pilot passed out again, with only laymen around? She was right, Cloud conceded, and she could take it. She was a Monarchan built of whalebone and rubber. She'd bend at her 3+ Gs, but she wouldn't break. The squatty insisted upon staying. Since Wynne had a woman of Tominga hidden from danger or run away from a fight, she could hold the pilot's head up through an acceleration that would put any damn fragile Tellurian into a pack. Or give her that funny axe and she'd show him how it ought to be swung. The Chickaladorian girl, too, stayed on. Her eyes not pink, but a deep, cool green, brimming with unshed tears, flashed at the idea of leaving her man to die alone. She just knew they were all going to die. Even if she couldn't be of any use, what of it? If her Flaskin died, she was going to die too, right then, and that was all there was to it. And if they made her go ashore, she'd cut her own throat that very minute. So that was that. So did the Vagian, tail tips twitching slightly, eyes sparkling. She swore by 3 deities to claw the eyes out of and then strangle with her tail anyone who tried to pull her off ship. She'd come to this ship to see things, and did Cloud think she was going to miss seeing this? Hardly. Cloud studied her briefly. The short, thick, incredibly soft fur, like the fur on the upper lip of a week-old kitten, except more so, did not conceal the determined set of her lovely jaw. The tight shorts and the even tighter, purely conventional breastband did not conceal the tigerish strength and agility of her lovely body. It'd be better, the blaster decided, not to argue the point. A dozen armed Dillions came aboard as prearranged, and the cruiser blasted off. Then, while Flaskin was maneuvering inert to familiarize himself with the controls and to calibrate the blast, Cloud brought out the 4 semi-portable projectors. They were frightful weapons designed for tripod mounting, so heavy that it took a very strong man to lift one on Earth. They carried no batteries or accumulators, but they were powered by tight beams from the mothership. Luda was right, such weapons were unknown in that solar system. They had no beam transmission of power. The Dillions radiated glee as they studied the things. They had stronger stuff, but it was fixed mount and far too heavy to move. This was wonderful. These were magnificent weapons indeed. High above the stratosphere, inert, the pilot found his spot and flipped the cruiser around, crosshairs centering the objective. Then, using his forward braking jets as drivers, he blasted her straight downward. She struck atmosphere almost with a thud. Only her fiercely driven meteorite screens and wall shields held her together. "I hope, Declono, you know what you're doing, chum," the Chickalodorian remarked conversationally, as the fortress below leaped upward with appalling speed. "I've made hot landings before, but I always had a hair or two of leeway. If you don't hit this to a couple of hundredths, we'll splash when we strike. We won't bounce, brother. I can compute it to 1,000th, and I can set the clicker to within 5, but it's you that have to do the real hitting." Cloud grinned back at the iron nerve pilot. "Sure, a 4-second call is enough to get your rhythm, allow for reaction time and lag, and blast right on the click?" "Absolutely. If I can't get it in 4, I can't get it at all. Got your stuff ready?" "Uh-huh." Cloud, staring into the radar scope, began to sway his shoulders. He knew the exact point in space and the exact instant of time at which the calculated deceleration must begin, by the aid of his millisecond timer, 2 full revolutions of the dial every second. He was about to set the clicker to announce that instant. His hand swayed back and forth, a finger snapped down. The sharp-toned instrument began to give out its crisp, precisely spaced clicks. "Got it," Cloud snapped, right on the middle of the click. "Get ready, Flaskin. Seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1, click!" Exactly with the click, the vessel's brakes cut off, and her terrific driving blast smashed on. There was a cruelly wrenching shock as everything aboard acquired suddenly a more than 3 times earthly weight. Luda and her fellows merely twitched. The Tumingan, standing behind the pilot, supporting and steadying his wounded head in its rest, settled almost imperceptibly, but her firmly gentle hands did not yield a millimeter. The Minarcan sank deeply into the cushioned bench upon which she was laying, her quick bright eyes remaining fixed upon her patient. The Chickalodorian girl in her hammock fainted quietly. The Vagian, who had flashed one hand up to an overhead bar at the pilot's first move, stood up, although she seemed to shorten a good 2 inches, and her tight upper garment parted with a snap, as back and shoulder muscles swelled to take the strain. That wouldn't worry her. Cloud knew. What was she stewing about? Oh, her tail! It was too heavy for its own strength, great as it was, to lift. Her left hand came down, around, and back. With its help, the tail came up. To the bar above her head, around it, tip pointing stiffly straight upward. Then, smiling gleefully at both Flaskin and the blaster, she shouted something that neither could understand, but which was the war cry of her race. "Tails high, brothers!" Downward the big ship hurtled, toward the now glowing screens of the fortress. Driving jets are not orthodox weapons, but properly applied they can be deadly ones indeed. And these were being applied with micrometric exactitude. Down, down, the threatened fortress and its neighbors hurled their every beam. Million ships dived frantically at the invader and did their useless best to blast her down. Down she drove, the fortress's screens flaming ever brighter under the terrific blast. Closer, hotter, still closer, hotter still. Nor did the furious flame waver. The Chickaladorian was indeed a master pilot. "Set up a +10, Thlaskin," Cloud directed. "Air density and temperature are changing. They're beams, too, you know." "Check. +10, sir. Set up." "Give it to her on the 4th click from this." "On, sir." The vessel seemed to pause momentarily, to stumble, but the added weight was almost imperceptible. A bare 100 yards now, and the ship of space was still plunging downward at terrific speed. The screens were furiously incandescent, but were still holding. 100 feet, velocity appallingly high, the enemy's screens still up. Something had to give now. If that screen stood up, the ship would vanish as she struck it. But Thlaskin the Chickaladorian made no move and spoke no word. If the skipper was willing to bet his own life on his computations, who was he to squawk? But he must have miscalculated. No! While the vessel's driving projectors were still a few yards away, the defending screens exploded into blackness. The awful streams of energy raved directly into the structures beneath. Metal and stone glared white, then flowed, sluggishly at first, but ever faster and more mobile, then boiled coruscantly into vapor. The cruiser slowed, stopped, seemed to hang for an instant poised. Then she darted upward, her dreadful exhaust continuing and completing the utter devastation. "That's computin', mister," the pilot breathed as he cut the fierce acceleration to a heavenly 1,000. "To figure a dive like that to 3 decimals and have the guts to hold it to cold, skipper, that's computation." "All yours, pilot," Cloud demurred. "All I did was give you the dope. You're the guy that made it good. Hurt anybody?" Nobody was. "QX, we'll repeat then on the other side of the lagoon." As the ship began to descend on the new course, the vengeful Dillian fleet arrived. Looping, diving, beaming, oftentimes crashing in suicidal collision, the two factions went maniacally to war. There were no attacks, however, against the plunging Tellurian ship. The Nilians had learned they could do nothing about that vessel. The second fortress fell exactly as the first had fallen. The pilot landed the cruiser in the middle of the shallow lakelet. Cloud saw that the Dillians, overwhelmingly superior in numbers now, had cleared the air of Nilian craft. "Can your fellows in your ships keep them off my flitter while I take my readings?" "We can," the natives radiated happily. 4 of the armored boneheads were wearing the semi-portable. They had them perched lightly atop their feeding heads, held immovably in place by 2 arms apiece. One hand sufficed to operate the controls, leaving 2 hands free to do whatever else might prove in order. "Let us out!" The lock opened. The Dillian warriors sprang out and splashed away to meet the enemy, who were already dashing into the lagoon. Cloud watched pure carnage. He hoped. Yes, there they were. The loyalists, seeing that their cause was not lost after all, had armed themselves and were smashing into the fray. The blaster broke out his flitter then, set it down near the vortex, and made his observations. Everything was normal. He selected 3 bombs from his vast stock, loaded them into the tubes, and lofted. He set his screens, adjusted his goggles, and waited, while far above him and wide around him his guardian Dillian war vessels toured watchfully, their drumming blasts a reassuring thunder. He waited, eyeing the sigma curve as it flowed backward from the recording pen, until he got a 10-second prediction. He shot the flitter forward, solving instantaneously the problems of velocity and trajectory. At exactly the correct instant, he released a bomb. He cut his drive and went free. The bomb sped truly, striking the vortex dead center. It penetrated deeply enough. The carefully weighted charge of Duodec exploded, its energy and that of the vortex combining in the detonation, whose like no inhabitant of that solar system had ever dimly imagined. The noxious gases and the pall of smoke and pulverized debris blew aside. The frightful waves of lava quieted down. The vortex was out and would remain out. The blaster drove back to the cruiser and put his flitter away. "Oh, you did it! Thanks! I didn't believe that anybody really could." Luda was almost hysterical in her joyous relief. "Nothing to it," Cloud deprecated. "How are you doing on the mopping up?" "Practically clean," Luda answered grimly. "We now know who is who. Those who fought against us, or who did not fight for us, are, or very soon will be, dead. But the Nilian fleet comes. Does yours? Ours takes off in moments." "Wait a minute." Cloud sat down at his plate, made observations and measurements, calculated mentally. He turned on his communicator and conferred briefly. "The Nolian fleet will be here in 7 hours and 18 minutes. If your people go out to meet them, it will mean a war that not even the patrol can stop, without destroying most of the ships and men both of you have in space. The patrol task force will arrive in 7 hours and 31 minutes. Therefore, I suggest that you hold your fleet here, in formation but quiescent, under instructions not to move until you order them to, while you and I go out and see if we can't stop the Nolians." "Stop them?" Luda's thought was not at all ladylike. "With what, pray?" "I don't know," Cloud confessed, "but it wouldn't do any harm to try, would it?" "Probably not. We'll try." All the way out Cloud pondered ways and means. As they neared the onrushing fleet, he thought at Luda. "Darjeeb is undoubtedly with that fleet. He knows that this is the only inertialess ship in this part of space. He wants it more than anything else in the universe. Now, if we could only make him listen to reason, if we could make him see—" He broke off. No soap. You couldn't explain green to a man born blind. These folks didn't know and wouldn't believe what real firepower was. The weakest vessel in this oncoming task force could blast both of these boneheads' fleets into a radiant gas in 15 seconds flat. And the super dreadnought's primaries would be starkly incredible to both Luda and Darjeeb. They simply had to be seen in action to be believed, and then it would be too late. These people didn't stand the chance of a bug under a sledgehammer, but they'd have to be killed before they'd believe it. A damn shame, too. The joy, the satisfaction, the real advancement possible only through cooperation, with each other and with the millions of races of galactic civilization, if there were only some means of making them believe. "We and they do believe," Luda broke into his somber musings. "Huh, what, you do? You were listening? Certainly, at your first thought I put myself on rapport with Darjeeb, and he and our peoples listened to your thoughts. But, you really believe me?" "We all believe. Some will cooperate, however, only as far as it will serve their own ends to do so. Your Lensmen will undoubtedly have to kill that insect Darjeeb and others of his kind in the interest of lasting peace." The insulted Nolian drove in a protesting thought, but Luda ignored it and went on. "You think then, Tellurian, that your Lensmen can cope with even such as Darjeeb of Null?" "I'll say they can." "It is well, then. Come aboard, Darjeeb, unarmed and unarmored as I am, and we will together go to confer with these visiting Lensmen of galactic civilization. It is understood that there will be no warfare until our return." "Holy Clono!" Cloud gasped. "He wouldn't do that, would he?" "Certainly." Luda was surprised at the question. "Although he is an insect, and morally and ethically beneath contempt, he is, after all, a reasoning being." QX. Cloud was dumbfounded, but tried manfully not to show it. Darjeeb came aboard. He was heavily bandaged, and most of his hands were useless, but he seemed to bear no ill will. Cloud gave orders. The ship flashed away to meet the patrolmen. The conference was held. The boneheads, after being taken through a super dreadnought and through a library by Lensmen as telepathic as themselves, capitulated to civilization immediately and wholeheartedly. "You won't need me any more, will you, Admiral?" the Cloud asked then. "I don't think so, no. Nice job, Cloud." "Thanks. I'll be on my way then. The people I picked up must be off my ship by this time. Clear ether." End of chapter 6.